we are not so badly off if we can admire Dutch painting. For that means we shrug off what we have been told for 100, 200 years, though we lost much of our previous confidence. Now we agree that those trees outside the window, which probably exist, only pretend to greenness and treeness, and that the language loses when it tries to cope with clusters of molecules. And yet it is here, a jar, a tin plate, a half-peeled lemon, walnuts, a loaf of bread, last, and so strongly, it is hard not to believe in their lastingness. And thus abstract art is brought to shame, even if we do not deserve any other. Therefore, I enter those landscapes under a cloudy sky from which a ray shoots out, and in the middle of dark plains, a spot of brightness glows. Or the shore with huts, boats, and on yellowish ice, tiny figures skating. All this is here eternally, just because once it was. Splendor, certainly incomprehensible, touches a cracked wall, a refuse heap, the floor of an inn, jerkins of the rustics, a broom, and two fish bleeding on a board. Rejoice, give thanks. I raised my voice to join them in their choral singing. Amid the ruffles, collets, and silky skirts, one of them already, who vanished long ago, and our song soared up like smoke from a censer. I begin with a poem written long time ago. When I was a young man, it was before the Second World War. Encounter. We were riding through frozen fields in a wagon at dawn. A red being rose in the darkness, and suddenly a hare ran across the road. One of us pointed to it with his hand. That was long ago. Today, neither of them is alive, not the hare nor the man who made the gesture. Oh, my love, where are they? Where are they going? The flash of hand, streak of movement, rustle of pebbles. I ask, not out of sorrow, but in wonder. And now, a poem which refers to my stay in the then capital of the world, Paris. As a young poet, I considered that it was proper to be acquainted with Paris, and everybody did that at that time. By passing Rue Descartes, I descended toward the Seine, shy, a traveler, a young barbarian, just come to the capital of the world. Where many, from Yassy and Kolochvar, Vilno and Bucharest, Saigon and Marrakesh, ashamed to remember the customs of our homes, about which nobody here should ever be told. The clapping of servants, barefooted girls hurry in, dividing food with incantations, choral prayers recited by master and household together. I had left the cloudy provinces behind. I entered the universal, dazzled and desiring. Soon enough, many from Yassi and Koloshvar or Saigon and Marrakesh would be killed because they wanted to abolish the customs of their homes. Soon enough, their peers were seizing power in order to kill in the name of the universal, beautiful ideas. Meanwhile, the city behaved in accordance with its nature, rustling with throaty laughter in the dark, baking long breads and pouring wine into clay pitchers, buying fish, lemons, and garlic at street markets, ignorant as it was, indifferent as it was to honor and shame and greatness and glory, because that had been done already and had transformed itself into monuments representing nobody knows whom, into arias hardly audible, and into turns of speech. Again, I lean on the rough granite of the embankment, as if I had returned from travels through the underworlds, and suddenly saw in the light the reeling wheel of the seasons, where empires have fallen, and those once living are now dead. There is no capital of the world, neither here nor anywhere else, and the abolished customs are restored to their small fame. And now I know that the time of human generation is not like the time of the earth. As to my heavy sins, I remember one most vividly, how one day, walking on a forest path along a stream, I passed a rock down onto a water snake coiled in the grass. And what I have met with in life was the just punishment, which reaches sooner or later the breaker of a taboo. I was brought up in Lithuania, which was the last country to be baptized, and old beliefs survived there. And the water snake was a holy creature. To harm water snake was a great breaking a taboo. Essay is a short poem in prose referring to a Parisian metro. It is a very short love affair of 1 minute and a half. And loaded with consequences in the sense that this is a philosophical poem, as you will see. I looked at that face, dumbfounded. The light of metro stations flew by. I didn't notice them. What can be done if our sight lacks absolute power to devour objects ecstatically in an instant, leaving nothing more than the void of an ideal form, a sign like a hieroglyph simplified from the drawing of an animal or bird? A slightly snub nose, a high brow, a slickly brushed back hair, the line of the chin. But why isn't the power of sight absolute? And in a whiteness tinged with pink, 2 sculpted holes containing a dark lustrous lava. To absorb that face, but to have it simultaneously against the background of all spring bows, walls, waves, in its weeping, its laughter, moving it back 15 years or around or ahead 30. To have, it is not even a desire, like a butterfly, a fish, the stem of a plant, only more mysterious. And so it befell me that after so many attempts at naming the world, I am able only to repeat, harping on one string, the highest, the unique avowal beyond which no power can attain. I am, she is. Shout, blow the trumpets, make 1,000 strong marches, rip, rend your clothing, repeating only is. She got out at Raspai. I was left behind with the immensity of existing things. A sponge, suffering because it cannot saturate itself. A river, suffering because reflections of clouds and trees are not clouds and trees. And the poem is entitled Esse, to be. I feel I should read something just for the sound of the original Polish. And maybe I would read a poem written at the time of war, which is under the Nazi occupation, when really that was the end of the world, in any case for many people. First I read in English. On the day the world ends, a bee circles a clover, a fisherman mends a glimmering net, happy purposes jump in the sea, by the rain sprout young sparrows are playing, and the snake is gold-skinned, as it should always be. On the day the world ends, women walk through the fields under their umbrellas. A drunkard grows sleepy at the edge of a lawn. Vegetable peddlers shout in the street, and a yellow-sailed boat comes nearer the island. The voice of a violin lasts in the air and leads into a starry night. And those who expected lightning and thunder are disappointed. And those who expected signs and archangel trumps do not believe it is happening now. As long as the sun and the moon are above, as long as the bumblebee visits a rose, as long as rosy infants are born, no one believes it is happening now. Only a white-haired old man who would be a prophet, yet is not a prophet, for he is much too busy, repeats while he binds his tomatoes, there will be no other end of the world, there will be no other end of the world. And then in the same, in Polish. W dzień końca świata pszczola krąży nad kwiatem na sturcji, rybak naprawia błyszczącą sieć, skaczą w morzu wesole delfiny, młode wróble czepiają się rynny i wąż ma złotą skórę, jak powinien mieć. W dzień końca świata kobiety idą polem pod parasolkami, pijak zasypia na brzegu trawnika, nawolują na ulicy sprzedawcy warzywa i łódka z żółtym żaglem do wyspy podpływa, dźwięk skrzypiec w powietrzu trwa i noc gwiaździsto odmyka. A którzy czekali błyskawic i gromów, są zawiedzeni. A którzy czekali znaków i archanielskich trąb, nie wierzą, że staje się już. Dopóki słońce i księżyc są w górze, dopóki trzmiel nawiedza róże, dopóki dzieci różowe się rodzą, nikt nie wierzy, że staje się już. Tylko siwy staruszek, który byłby prorokiem, ale nie jest prorokiem, bo ma inne zajęcie, powiada przewiązując pomidory. Innego końca świata nie będzie, innego końca świata nie będzie. I feel that since in the program there are two poems of mine, I should read them here. Those poems are Realism and Incantation. We are not so badly off if we can admire Dutch painting, for that means we shrug off what we have been told for 100, 200 years, though we lost much of our previous confidence. Now we agree that those trees outside the window, which probably exist, only pretend to greenness and treeness, and that the language loses when it tries to cope with clusters of molecules. And yet it is here, a jar, a tin plate, a half-peeled lemon, walnuts, a loaf of bread, last, and so strongly. It is hard not to believe in their lastingness. And thus abstract art is brought to shame, even if we do not deserve any other. Therefore, I enter those landscapes under a cloudy sky from which a ray shoots out, and in the middle of dark plains, a spot of brightness glows. Or the shore with huts, boats, and on yellowish ice, tiny figures skating. All this is here eternally, just because once it was. Splendor, certainly incomprehensible, touches a cracked wall, a refuse heap, the floor of an inn, jerkins of the rustics, a broom, and 2 fish bleeding on a board. Rejoice, give thanks. I raised my voice to join them in their choral singing, amid the ruffles, collets, and silky skirts. One of them already, who vanished long ago, and our song soared up like smoke from a censer. And the second poem is Incantation. Incantation, I should say that in the original title has even stronger meaning of throwing spells. So it should be rather called throwing spells. Human reason is beautiful and invincible. No bars, no barbed wire, no pulping of books, no sentence of banishment can prevail against it. It establishes the universal ideas in language and guides our hand. So we write truth and justice with capital letters, lie and oppression with small. It puts what should be above things as they are, is an enemy of despair and a friend of hope. It doesn't know Jew from Greek or slave from master. It saves austere and transparent phrases from the filthy discord of tortured words. It says that everything is new under the sun, opens the congealed feast of the past. Beautiful and very young are philosophia and poetry, her ally in the service of the good. As late as yesterday, nature celebrated their birth. The news was brought to the mountains by the unicorn and an echo. Their friendship will be glorious. Their times has no limit. Their enemies have delivered themselves to destruction. A gift, this short poem, I am proud to tell that it was chosen for a Buddhist anthology. I'm not a Buddhist, but in any case I consider that this poem is much in the spirit, maybe, of detachment of Buddhism. A day so happy, fog lifted early. I worked in the garden. Hummingbirds were stopping over honeysuckle flowers. There was nothing on earth I wanted to possess. I knew no one worth my envying him. Whatever evil I had suffered, I forgot. To think that once I was the same man didn't embarrass me. In my body, I felt no pain. When straightening up, I saw the blue sea and sails. However, I must say, I must read a poem which is very far from this state of mind. And it is entitled Not Mine. You see, I believe that an artist and a poet in every human society is somewhat a stranger. And I lived under capitalism, under communism, and I never felt at ease because I saw things around me. All my life to pretend this world of theirs is mine. And to no, such pretending is disgraceful. But what can I do? Suppose I screamed suddenly and started to prophesy. No one would hear me. Their screens and microphones are not for that. Others, like me, wander the streets and talk to themselves, sleep on benches in parks or on pavement in alleys, for there are not enough prisons to lock up all the poor. I smile and keep quiet. They won't get me now. To feast with the chosen, that I do well. I doubt whether a poet can be free from remorse in any system. This is about dogs. I feel probably many people in the audience are dogs lovers. So for them maybe. The warmth of dogs and the essence inscrutable of doggishness. Yet I feel it in the lolling of the humid tongue, in the melancholy velvet of the eyes, in the scent of fur, different from our own, yet related. Our humanness becomes more marked than the common one, pulsating, slavering, hairy. Though for the dogs, it is we who are like gods, disappearing in crystal palaces of reason, busy with activities beyond comprehension. I want to believe that the forces above us, engaged in doings we cannot imitate, touch our cheeks and our hair sometimes, and feel in themselves this poor flesh and blood. Well, I hesitate. Maybe I should read it. My only poem written directly in English, not in Polish. I couldn't write in Polish because this is a form of a letter to Raja Rao, a Hindu philosopher and a Brahmin, whom I met in Austin, Texas, and he tried to convert me. Trying to convince me that really all Greek philosophy comes from India. And to Raja Rao, Raja, I wish I knew the cause of that malady. For years I couldn't accept the place I was in. I felt I should be somewhere else. A city, trees, human voices lack the quality of presence. I would live by the hope of moving on. Somewhere else there was a city of real presence, of real trees and voices, and friendship and love. Link, if you wish, my peculiar case on the border of schizophrenia to the messianic hope of my civilization. Ill at ease in the tyranny, ill at ease in the republic. In the one, I longed for freedom. In the other, for the end of corruption. Building in my mind a permanent polis, forever deprived of aimless bustle. I learned at last to say, this is my home, here, before the glowing call of ocean sunsets, on the shore which faces the shores of your Asia, in a great republic, moderately corrupt. Raja, this didn't cure me of my guilt and shame, a shame of failing to be what I should have been. The image of myself grows gigantic on the wall, and against it, my miserable shadow. That's how I came to believe in original sin, which is nothing but the first victory of the ego. Tormented by my ego, deluded by it, I give you, as you see, a ready argument. I hear you saying that liberation is possible, and that Socratic wisdom is identical with your gurus. No, Raja, I must start from what I am. I am those monsters which visit my dreams and reveal to me my hidden essence. If I am sick, there is no proof whatsoever that man is a healthy creature. Greece had to lose her pure consciousness, have to make our agony only more acute. We needed God loving us in our weakness and not in the glory of beatitude. No help, Raja. My part is agony, struggle, abjection, self-love and self-hate, prayer for the kingdom, and reading Pascal. And maybe it's proper to read immediately about my very modest philosophy, modest Weltanschauung, philosophically. This is a philosophical poem in 6 lines. If I had to tell what the world is for me, I would take a hamster or a hedgehog or a mole and place him in a theater seat one evening, and bringing my ear close to his humid snout, would listen to what he says about the spotlights, sounds of the music, and the movements of the dance. That's a modest philosophy. And there is a very short poem entitled Myness. My parents, my husband, my brother, my sister. I am listening in a cafeteria at breakfast. The women's voices rustle, fulfill themselves in a ritual, no doubt necessary. I glance sidelong at their moving lips, and I delight in being here on earth for one more moment with them, here on earth, to celebrate our tiny, tiny myness. And here is a poem entitled Rivers, which is probably one of poems which I would like to read, to write only and not others, because this is a poem of ecstatic poem of praise. And written at the time when rivers were not yet polluted. In any case, describing experience of the time when rivers were not yet polluted. Under various names, I have praised only you, rivers. You are milk and honey and love and death and dance. From a spring in hidden grottos, sipping from mossy rocks, where a goddess pours live water from a pitcher, at clear streams in the meadow, where rills murmur underground, your race and my race begin, and amazement and quick passage. Naked, I exposed my face to the sun, steering with hardly a dip of the paddle. Oak woods, fields, a pine forest skimming by. Around every bend, the promise of the earth. Village smoke, sleepy herds, flights of martins over sandy bluffs. I entered your water slowly, step by step, and the current in that silence took me by the knees. Until I surrendered, and it carried me, and I swam through the huge reflected sky of a triumphant noon. I was on your banks at the onset of midsummer night, when the full moon rolls out and lips touch in the rituals of kissing. I hear in myself now and then the lapping of water in the boathouse and the whisper that calls me in for an embrace and for consolation. We go down with the bells ringing in all the sunken cities, forgotten. We are greeted by the embassies of the dead, with your endless flowing, while your endless flowing carries us on, and neither is nor was, the moment only, eternal. Well, this is a poem entitled in Châtaigne, the place where I was born. And I returned after 52 years there, 52 years absence. And this is a poem really commemorating my mother, who taught me there how to write, and put letters on a page of paper, and I was absolutely sure that I would never master that art. But somehow I mastered. And this is a poem, few parts. I would read one part. You held the reins and we were riding, you and me, in a one-horse britchka for a visit to the big village by the forest. The branches of the apple trees and the pear trees were bowed down under the weight of fruits. Ornate carved porches stood out above little gardens of mallows and rue. Your former pupils, now farmers, entertained us with talks of crops. Women showed their looms and deliberated with you about the colors of the warp and the woof. On the table, slices of ham and sausage, a honeycomb in a clay bowl, and I was drinking kvass from a tin cup. I asked the director of the collective farm to show me that village. He took me to the fields, stretching up to the edge of the forest, stopping the car before a huge boulder. Here was the village of Peikswa, he said, not without triumph in his voice, as is usual with those on the winning side. I noticed that one part of the boulder was hacked away. Somebody had tried to smash the stone with a hammer so that not even the trace remained. That village and other neighboring villages were deported to Siberia The orchards were eradicated, houses destroyed, and only fields remained. So, however, I would like to escape history. It constantly was catching up with me. Maybe a very strange poem. I am a little afraid of reading it because it's so unconventional, but it is entitled to Mrs. Professor in defense of my cat's honor, and not only. Because that lady wrote an article where she mentioned cruelty of some animals, cruelty of cats. My valiant helper, a small-sized tiger, slips sweetly on my desk by the computer, unaware that you insult his tribe. Cats play with a mouse or with a half-dead mole. You are wrong, though. It's not out of cruelty. They simply like a thing that moves. For after all, we know that only consciousness can, for a moment, move into the other, empathize with the pain and the panic of a mouse. And such as cats are, all of nature is, indifferent, alas, to the good and the evil. Quite a problem for us, I am afraid. National history has its museums, but why should our children learn about monsters, an earth of snakes and reptiles for millions of years? Nature devouring, nature devoured, butchery day and night, smoking with blood. And who created it? Was it the good Lord? Yes, undoubtedly they are innocent. Spiders, mantises, sharks, pythons. We are the only ones who say cruelty. Our consciousness and our conscience, alone in the pale anthill of galaxies, put their hope in a humane God who cannot but feel and think, who is kindred to us by his worth and movement, for we are, as he told us, similar to him. Yet if it is so, he takes pity on every mauled mouse, every wounded bird. The universe for him is like a crucifixion. Such is the outcome of your attack on the cat. A theological, Augustinian grimace which makes difficult our walking on this earth. This is a blatantly philosophical or theological poem, if you prefer. And this is a poem which somewhat, I'm not sure of the names of the plants, whether they convey the same as in the original, because the thistle, the nettle, the burdock and belladonna are plants growing in ruins, empty lots, and so on. The thistle, the nettle, the burdock, and belladonna have a future. Theirs are wastelands and rusty railroad tracks, the sky, silence. Who shall I be for man many generations later, when after the noise of languages, the word goes to silence? I was to be redeemed by the gift of arranging words, but must be prepared for an earth without grammar, for the thistle, the nettle, the burdock, the belladonna, and a small wind above them, a sleepy cloud, silence. Not everything is lost, because there are angels, and I am going to read a poem on angels. All was taken away from you, white dresses, wings, even existence. Yet I believe you, messengers. There, where the world is turned inside out, a heavy fabric embroidered with stars and beasts, you stroll, inspecting the trustworthy seams. Short is your stay here. Now and then at a matinal hour, if the sky is clear, in a melody repeated by a bird, or in the smell of apples at the close of day, when the light makes the orchards magic. They say somebody had invented you. But to me, this doesn't sound convincing, for humans invented themselves as well. The voice, no doubt it is a valid proof, as it can belong only to radiant creatures, weightless and winged after all, why not? Girdled with the lightning. I have heard that voice many a time when asleep. And what is strange, I understood more or less an order or an appeal in an unearthly tongue. Day draws near. Another one, do what you can. At a certain age, we wanted to confess our sins, but there were no takers. White clouds refused to accept them, and the wind was too busy visiting one sea after another. We didn't succeed in interesting the animals. Dogs disappointed, expected an order. A cat, as always immoral, was falling asleep. A person seemingly very close didn't care to hear of things long past. Conversations with friends over vodka or coffee ought not to be prolonged beyond the first sign of boredom. It would be humiliating to pay by the hour a man with a diploma just for listening. Churches, perhaps churches, but to confess their what? That we used to see ourselves as handsome and noble, and yet later, in our place, an ugly toad half opens his thick eyelids and one says clearly, that's me. Maybe I should read now the last poem. Pure beauty, benediction, you are all I gathered from a life that was bitter and confused, in which I learned about evil, my own and not my own. Wonder kept seizing me, and I recall only wonder, risings of the sun over endless green, a universe of grasses and flowers opening to the first light, blue outline of the mountain, and a Hosanna shout. I asked, how many times? Is this the truth of the earth? How can laments and curses be turned into hymns? What makes you need to pretend when you know better? But the lips praised on their own. On their own the feet ran. The heart beat strongly, and the tongue proclaimed its adoration. Thank you. Thank you.
What about English poets? Do you have, other than Shakespeare, Mr. Miłosz translated As You Like It once upon a time, but among the lyric poets in English, are there ones?
Very deeply in Blake.
Mm.
In Blake, and because of Blake in Swedenborg, and no wonder that Blake, because in the 60s in Berkeley. That was Blake sung, recited, and a wonderful magic interpretation of the mental traveler sung with a guitar, performed by students.
Huh.
Yeah.
And what is it in Ginsberg's verse in Allen Ginsberg's poetry that appeals to you?
Well, just the opposite of my temperament. I defined myself as a square. And Ginsberg said, well, you are not as square as you pretend to be.
That's very nice. Not only in Unattainable Earth, but also in other books, you've talked about two perspectives on mankind. One perspective, if I can quote you, according to the first perspective, on a minuscule ball of earth in a smudge of mold called a city, some microorganisms, it's us, move around, less durable than mayflies. And that is how a scientist or a historian might see us from a great distance. Then you add the second perspective. According to the second perspective, you say, that of a reversed telescope, every one of these beings grows up to the size of a cathedral and surpasses in its complexity any nature, living or inert. Can you say something about those two perspectives and how they operate in your work?
Yeah, of course, from the second perspective is religious, can be founded on religion, but otherwise this is a mystery of individuality. If you enter in a museum or art gallery, big art museum, you see a painting on a wall far in the opposite wall, and you immediately recognize a painter. You know that this must be this painter. You come closer and you recognize that this is precisely this painter. This is a mystery of individuality exemplified. And then the popular lines on fingers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Fingerprints.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a mystery of individuality. Strange principium individuationis.
Do you think that any poetry can, what shall I say? Does your poetry go back and forth between the long historical perspective or even the scientific perspective and this individualized detail?
Yes, even a perspective of insects and macro, big dimension, moving constantly from one to another, trying to keep them somehow as contradiction.
So that you wouldn't want to do without either one, either the long view or the...
Precise.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you think we all, as part of being in the 20th century, we all have both perspectives in play, perhaps?
Yeah. And I guess film and television is important in this respect. Because if you take a city in a film, seen as a multitude of little points moving in the street, and you think that in every little point there are human beings. That's very it influences enormously our thinking. But already in 1939, I remember I wrote in an essay that thinking of human beings as that minuscule points and mass sort of mold on the surface of the earth, that must be a beloved dream of tyrants and dictators.
Who must eliminate individuality in the mass.
Yeah.
You also say that the true shape of the human species is childhood, youth, readiness, exploration. And I wonder how you make this constant freshness visible in poetry, even when the subject, the theme of the poem, might be anguish or weariness or agony.
I believe that to have a happy childhood means to have a sacramental experience, so to say. And so I had very happy childhood on a farm of my grandparents. And it persists, it protects against utter pessimism, because otherwise my vision of the world is very dark, as you know. But I have written under the Nazi occupation in 1943, one of the worst years, a long poem composed by short poems in quatrains, in primers quatrains, the world. And that was written against the horror surrounding me at that time, against the horror of really hell of the Nazi occupation. It's a sort of the world as it should be, but which is not. To my surprise now, in elementary schools in Poland, children learn by heart those little poems, and I feel very uneasy, because that's how to take, for instance, William Blake's Songs of Innocence, forgetting about the songs of experience. And so I feel responsible for those poems, that children receive only that bright side of the world.
Yes, well, it's a wonderful series of poems, The World, and there aren't many poems giving the bright side of the world, so it probably doesn't do the children any harm to have at least one experience. What was it that made your childhood so happy?
Well, I guess that because I was a lone child who has the whole world for myself. There was no competition.
May still be true. Is there any hope for those of us who had unhappy childhoods?
No, and
No.
This question. No, this question leads us to some other points you've touched.
Yes, I mean, you had said at some point, I don't know when it was, a sense of great separateness set in you, so that you felt you were outside, in a way, the human species almost. And you compared yourself to the little mermaid in Hans Christian Andersen's tale, saying, like the mermaid from Andersen's tale, I tried to walk correctly, but a thin pain reminded me that I was foolish to try to imitate people. And you added elsewhere, captive of my sensual nature, only through lovemaking was I able to experience myself dissolving in communion, alive among the living. And I wondered whether that sense of outsideness is what made you an artist, whether you think all artists feel comparably outside.
Well, I guess you touch this a very important problem, which is connected with a distance in quotation with Thomas Mann, you know. And
Shall I read that quotation? Shall I
Yes,
read the quotation?
yes.
This is from Mann's Tonio Kröger, where Mann says, the very gift of style, of form and expression is nothing else than this cool and fastidious attitude towards humanity. You might say that there has to be this impoverishment and devastation as a preliminary condition, so that this aesthetic response, perhaps,
I guess that in Thomas Mann, it stems directly from Schopenhauer. And I am a great admirer of Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer considered that will, namely that driving force, our desires, fears, and so on, is contrary to art, because art comes from detachment. And now that aspect of Schopenhauer can be understood very well in America because of Buddhism. Many people read on Buddhism and so on, and detachment. And so precisely that detachment, when will is subdued and not concerned with desires, passions, fears, but a distance, the mind takes a distance from that world. That's the domain of art. And for that reason, Schopenhauer considered that childhood is the most creative period in human life. And every child is a genius. Because at that time, the mind works very well already, but the passions, and the most devastating passion is, of course, sex passion, is not yet awakened. And that's why childhood is such a beautiful period, so creative.
Did he never see the greed and murderousness of children? Did Schopenhauer not observe children in their will?
Well, I feel that perhaps Schopenhauer underestimated this element of will in children. Yeah, but nevertheless, what is interesting that returning to Thomas Mann, something he took from Schopenhauer and introduced illness as a factor which contributes to genius and literary artistic creation. In Thomas Mann always there is that factor. Not because illness by itself produces art, but because produces the distance. And I believe in Schopenhauer, you can deride me, but I believe, and you may wonder why suddenly this sort of distance in the 20th century is so stressed, a kind of remorse that our approach to art is that of distance. There are many causes, because there is a contradiction. I would like to be a detached artist and describe reality from a distance. Simone Weil, whom I translated into Polish, says, distance is the soul of beauty. But when you are confronted with the horrors of the 20th century, of course such a distance produces remorse. And it's very difficult to say that I am not my brother's keeper. And so this is the explanation of that remorse. While distance of the artist, I guess, in the past was not rare, but was understood by artists. I even remember a poem, a Polish poem of the Baroque period, when the poet says, well, I call your eyes stars, but they are not stars.
Yes. Shakespeare said something like that too.
Yes.
So that you think the poet in himself tolerated a distance better than the contemporary poet does, did not feel a moral guilt attaching to it in the past.
But I must say that Tadeusz Borowski, who was in Auschwitz, and later on wrote the stories, cruel stories, This Way to Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, wrote that under the influence of Hemingway. So this shows the role of the distance. he found himself after Auschwitz in Dachau, was liberated by Americans, lived for a while in Munich and started to read Hemingway. And under the influence of that cold, detached way of writing, he wrote his Auschwitz stories. So this shows to what extent direct approach is impossible.
Yes.
Yeah.
When were you conscious first of this distance in yourself? When were you first conscious in yourself of this distance?
I don't know. In any case, I started not by writing poetry, emotional poetry, but writing exercises imitating French poets of La Pléiade.
Did you? Du Bellay?
In high school, yeah.
In high school?
Yeah.
You have mentioned Du Bellay and Ronsard in your writings, and
yes.
Did you have a preference between them?
Well, let us not exaggerate my knowledge of French at that time. I found that sonnet of Du Bellay in my textbook, French textbook. That in any case it shows that my sort of detached attitude.
Even then, yes, that you went through the French.
Yeah.
You were writing sonnets then?
Yeah.
In Polish?
Yeah.
Like Du Bellay's and Ronsard's?
Yeah.
I see. Were you writing in longer forms than sonnets as well?
No.
No.
Besides, it was so long ago that I don't remember.
I wanted to ask you what your own favorite was. Which one of your own volumes you like the best, if you can choose among them? Or are they all equally your children and equally your favorites of the books as they came out in Polish? Which one was, looking back now, do you have a favorite one?
From the Rising of the Sun.
And can you say why?
It was written at the time when really I didn't hope to reach the Polish audience. It was
1974.
Written in Berkeley, yeah. And I gave a free vent to my musings about what is my force, namely history of my county, of my birthplace, and so on. So it is an example of singing to myself and the muse.
And it was also a mixture of genres as well. You mixed prose and verse.
Yes, and that
first person, third person.
That was my constant concern, to enlarge the possibilities of lyrical poetry. And that's why I am now in a strong opposition to French poetry, because they after Mallarmé, they tended to write purer and purer poetry. And when you receive absolute purity, nothing of the surrounding world remains.
Well, as the poem called Realism, printed in the program tonight, shows, you are very much concerned that the real world should remain. I wanted to ask you, too, what part of the composition of poetry you have found most emotionally difficult or most emotionally taxing, because you've said that you have a daimonion who are many voices who speak within you, and that it speaks through you in a quotation, odious rhythmic speech which grooms itself and of its own accord moves on. And I wonder what that means about the composition of poetry for you, that a voice arises in you. Do you transcribe from the voice? Do you revise the voice?
No, usually I have a first line dictated, sort of, I hear that incantation. And then I toil to write next line harmonizing with the first.
And then the third has to
and
harmonize
the third
with the
has
first
to,
and second.
and that's what I
See.
mean, that compulsion, you know,
Yes.
that the rhythm takes you and carries you against your will.
To a Polish reader, are your rhythms reminiscent of other Polish poetry? Would a Polish reader hear rhythms that were familiar from Baroque poetry or from 19th century Polish poetry in you? Do you feel a rhythmic connection to earlier poets?
Yeah, and I believe that this is the greatest difficulty in translating poetry, because stylistic allusions are unheard in translation. And stylistic allusions to poetry of the 18th century, of the 16th century, and so on, and they cannot be conveyed. Historical allusions also, it's very difficult to convey. In Polish, I can introduce that by one word, placing, referring to something which happened in 1800, let us say. In English, I can.
No, it's lost, it's
Yeah.
gone. I wanted to ask you about your two voices, the elemental style that you mentioned using in the world, that style of extreme simplicity, even naivete, which recurs too in parts of poems, of other poems, and then the style of a kind of grim irony, fully historically informed, that you use elsewhere, irony which you say is the glory of slaves. Do you prefer one side or to the other of those two?
No, I would prefer to write ecstatic poems and not to be ironic at all. But in this program, I find my poem Incantation. And this is sort of, I invoke reason. As a matter of fact, this poem is very self-conscious in the sense that it refers to another epoch, to the 18th century, when reason was valued highly, and the ideas of the Enlightenment were common. And so I write that poem. It is not that reality is like that. Again, I refer by invocation of reason, by stylistic devices, to the 18th century, to the Enlightenment. So this is also a poem, I should say, of irony.
Mm. But it's also a poem of some degree of faith, would you not say?
Yes, but I regret that it is very difficult to write such a poem today without that layer of
irony.
allusion.
Yes.
Directly. A poet who would write such poem directly would be accused of primitivism.
Yes, it's true, yes.
Yes.
I wonder, one of my favorite quotations comes from a remark you made about your life of writing, where you say, "With the flick of a wrist, I fashioned an invisible rope and climbed it, and it held me." Yet in the same poem, a minute later, you define yourself as an American community who knew nothing about you, but your name might define you as, ironically, Wrong Honorable Professor Miłosz, who wrote poems in some unheard of tongue. And then at the same time, the massive indifference, you might say, of the American public to poetry.
Well, that double perspective, I feel was very healthy for me. And of course, I was in Berkeley, professor at an obscure Department of Slavic Languages. What is that Slavic language? And was writing that poem. It's besides this, comes from a poem entitled "The Magic Mountain," because Berkeley was a magic mountain.
a desert, mountains, quite unlike the countrysides you had known in both Poland and France. And then you sort of looked at it and said, this is what has been given to me, and proceeded to make poetry out of it. Did you ever doubt that you would be able to do that? Did it seem
Oh,
to you?
yes, yes. All those landscapes were, for me, not human. Somehow, in general, California's nature is not very friendly towards human beings. That's maybe for that reason white men avoided California for so long time. But then slowly it grows on you, yes.
You say, in speaking about nature, in a poem in You Whose Name, you represent a Manichaean world in which there is a defender of clarity and form that you name mind, spirit, maker, renewer, and that's always in combat with nature, who is aggressor and devourer. And you say of yourself that you have served mind in the investiture of forms. And that's a very pregnant phrase, in the investiture of forms. And that has been your service. And what does that phrase mean to you? Or can you unpack that somewhat for us?
Yes, and this is I can refer to Schopenhauer's theory of art, and that opposition between nature and the human mind. Just a few days ago, I wrote an introduction to a little book by Charles Baudelaire, Constantin Guy, peintre de la vie moderne, new translations into Polish. Well, in Baudelaire, you have that absolute opposition, human mind and nature. For him, there is no art and no morality in nature. Nature can teach you cannibalism only.
What about the
So
correspondence?
very sharp opposition of the mind and nature.
But in Correspondance, he seems to say something else, does he not? That there is a correspondence between man and nature?
Yeah. When I was a student in Paris, I had to learn by heart the Correspondance of Baudelaire. But that's something else. That's complex. But in any case, Baudelaire went so far that the part of that essay is praise of maquillage.
Mm-hmm. Makeup.
Makeup, yes. Because woman, the less natural is, the better.
A very French remark. I wonder if you could say something about the moment of composition of either of both of the poems that are printed in the program, either about the moment when you composed realism or the moment when you composed incarnation.
Incantation.
I'm sorry, excuse me, incantation. Freudian slip.
Realism is a result of my visiting an exhibition of Dutch painting in Boston.
Boston.
Yeah, that was an exhibition. So I came home and wrote that. And even I bought a catalog with reproductions. So this is very obvious impulse. Incantation, I don't remember. In any case, it was a reaction to some political events, obviously.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, I am happy to know that realism is a Boston poem because I come from Boston, so I will now have a reason to cherish it further. When you say in your Ars Poetica, that wonderful poem, you say, I have always aspired to a more spacious form that will be free from the claims of poetry or prose. And I wonder what you think the claims of poetry are and the claims of prose and how you can be free of both and what kind of spaciousness that means to you.
Yeah, for me prose should be as prosaic as possible. Yes, I have tried to enlarge, and I realized that very young, before the war already, that poetry is a kind of a circle, chalk circle, in which poets move, and they cannot go out of that circle because there's exigencies of form. And sort of tyranny of form. For that reason, you mentioned Robinson Jeffers. I liked Robinson Jeffers because he rebelled against that tyranny of form in American poetry under the impact, of course, of French symbolism. And he decided to speak directly about his philosophy, which I do not share quite. But in any case, I appreciate the daring. And Whitman is an example of just the opposite of the purity of poetry, because he's a big river carrying everything, not only gold and diamonds, but trees and silt and so on. So this has been quite conscious effort on my part to enlarge the sphere of poetry.
Well, I think we have come full circle. We started with Whitman. We've come back to Whitman as the great ongoing river, carrying everything. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. One of the first spectacles of the play in Paris in the 50s. And the public roared with laughter all the time.
Now, without any further ado, it's a great honor to present the Nobel laureate, Czesław Miłosz.
I am going to read my poetry in translation. I have been living in America a long time, but continuing to write in Polish because the language, you know, if you change the language, you change personality. And besides, my poetry in the original, my native tongue is better probably than written, than had I been writing in English. And in Berkeley, where I have been teaching for many years, I do not teach anymore, I'm retired, we had a team of friends, something very unique in America, and this huge book, my collected poems, is a result of that teamwork. I mean, translating together with my colleagues, mostly Robert Haas, Robert Pinsky, Leonard Nathan, poets from Berkeley. And of course, translation is for me a means of
communication with the American audiences, which I esteem very much, the possibility of communication. I would start with a poem, Rue Descartes. When I was a young poet, every poet from my part of Europe was supposed to spend some time as an apprentice in the capital of the world, at that time Paris. And many years later, returning to that city, I wrote that poem by passing Rue Descartes. By passing Rue Descartes, I descended toward the Seine, shy, a traveler, a young barbarian, just come to the capital of the world. We were many, from Jassy and Kolochvar, Vilno and Bucharest, Saigon and Marrakesh, ashamed to remember the customs of our homes, about which nobody here should ever be told, the clapping for servants, barefooted girls hurry in, dividing food with incantations, choral prayers recited by master and household together. I had left the cloudy provinces behind. I entered the universal, dazzled and desiring. Soon enough, many from Jassy and Kolochvar or Saigon or Marrakesh would be killed because they wanted to abolish the customs of their homes. Soon enough, their peers were seizing power in order to kill in the name of the universal beautiful ideas. Meanwhile, the city behaved in accordance with its nature, rustling with throaty laughter in the dark, baking long breads and pouring wine into clay pitchers, buying fish, lemons, and garlic at street markets, indifferent as it was to honor and shame and greatness and glory, because that had been done already and had transformed itself into monuments representing nobody knows whom, into arias hardly audible, and into turns of speech. Again, I lean on the rough granite of the embankment, as if I had returned from travels through the underworlds, and suddenly saw in the light the reeling wheel of the seasons, where empires have fallen, and those once living are now dead. There is no capital of the world, neither here nor anywhere else, and the abolished customs are restored to their small fame, and now I know that the time of human generations is not like the time of the earth. As to my heavy sins, I remember one most vividly, how one day, walking on a forest path along a stream, I pushed a rock down onto a water snake coiled in the grass. And what I have met with in life was the just punishment which reaches sooner or later the breaker of a taboo. As a commentary to this poem, I must add that I was born in Lithuania, which was the last country in Europe to accept Christianity, and many pagan beliefs survived. The water snake was a holy creature in Lithuania, and there was a taboo, and one shouldn't harm a water snake. Since I am with Paris, a city where I spent many years of my life, I am going to read a poem, a short poem about love, which lasted 1 minute and a half. And it takes place in a Parisian metro. I looked at that face dumbfounded. The lights of metro stations flew by. I didn't notice them. What can be done if our sight lacks absolute power to to devour objects ecstatically in an instant, leaving nothing more than the void of an ideal form, a sign like a hieroglyph simplified from the drawing of an animal or bird. A slightly snubbed nose, a high brow with slickly brushed back hair, the line of the chin. But why isn't the power of sight absolute? And in a whiteness tinged with pink, two sculpted holes containing a dark, lustrous lava. To absorb that face, but to have it simultaneously against the background of all spring balls, walls, waves, in its weeping, its laughter, moving it back 15 years or ahead 30. To have. It is not even a desire, like a butterfly, a fish, the stem of a plant, only more mysterious. And so it befell me that after so many attempts at naming the world, I am able only to repeat, harping on one string, the highest, the unique avowal, beyond which no power can attain. I am, she is. Shout, blow the trumpets, make 1,000-strong marches, leap, rend your clothing, repeating only is. She got out at Raspai. I was left behind with the immensity of existing things, a sponge, suffering because it cannot saturate itself, a river, suffering because reflections of clouds and trees are not clouds and trees. And the poem is entitled Esse, to be. During the war, which I spent in Warsaw, I have written many tragic poems, which I wouldn't like to read in order not to return to the horrible era. But I would read one, which besides you have in the program, a song for the end of the world. And I would read it in English and in Polish so that you can compare. On the day the world ends, a bee circles a clover, a fisherman mends a glimmering net, happy porpoises jump in the sea, in the rain spout young sparrows are playing, and the snake is gold-skinned as it should always be. On the day the world ends, women walk through the fields under their umbrellas, a drunkard grows sleepy at the edge of a lawn, vegetable peddlers shout in the street, and a yellow-sailed boat comes nearer the island. The voice of a violin lasts in the air and leads into a starry night. And those who expected lightning and thunder are disappointed. And those who expected signs and archangels' trumps do not believe it is happening now. As long as the sun and the moon are above, as long as the bumblebee visits a rose, as long as rosy infants are born, no one believes it is happening now. Only a white-haired old man who would be a prophet, yet is not a prophet for he's much too busy, repeats while he binds his tomatoes. There will be no other end of the world. There will be no other end of the world. And now the same in Polish. W dzień końca świata pszczoła krąży nad kwiatem na sturcji, rybak naprawia błyszczącą sieć, skaczą w morzu wesole delfiny, młode wróble czepiają się rynny i wąż ma złotą skórę, jak powinien mieć. W dzień końca świata kobiety idą polem pod parasolkami, pijak zasypia na brzegu trawnika. Nawołują na ulicy sprzedawcy warzywa i łódka z żółtym żaglem do wyspy podpływa, dźwięk skrzypiec w powietrzu trwa i noc gwiaździstą odmyka. a którzy czekali błyskawic i gromów, są zawiedzeni. A którzy czekali znaków i archanielskich trąb, nie wierzą, że staje się już. Dopóki słońce i księżyc są w górze, dopóki trzmiel nawiedza róże, dopóki dzieci różowe się rodzą, nikt nie wierzy, że staje się już. Tylko siwy staruszek, który byłby prorokiem, ale nie jest prorokiem, bo ma inne zajęcie, powiada, przewiązując pomidory: innego końca świata nie będzie, innego końca świata nie będzie. I was invited in '81 to give 6 lectures on poetry at Harvard, and I was scared, but somehow I wrote those 6 lectures, and they are even published in the form, as in a book form, as The Witness of Poetry. But then I thought that maybe I should write 6 lectures in verse, because they have a merit. They are much shorter than lectures, than papers. And so I wrote those 6 lectures in verse, and I'm going to read one. They are mostly preoccupied with the events of our epoch of the 20th century. So one of them, I would read lecture number 4. Reality. What can we do with it? Where is it in words? Just as it flickers, it vanishes. Innumerable lives unremembered. Cities on maps only, without that face in the window, on the first floor, by the market, without those 2 in the bushes near the gas plant. Returning seasons, mountain snows, oceans, and the blue ball of the earth rotates, but silent are they who ran through artillery fire, who clung to a lump of clay for protection, and those deported from their homes at dawn, and those who have crawled out from under a pile of bodies. While here I, an instructor in forgetting, teach that pain passes, for it's the pain of others. Still in my mind, trying to save Miss Jadwiga, a little hunchback, librarian by profession, who perished in the shelter of the apartment house that was considered safe, but toppled down, and no one was able to dig through the slabs of wall, though knocking and voices were heard for many days. So a name is lost for ages, forever. No one will ever know about her last hours. Time carries her in layers of the Pliocene. The true enemy of man is generalization. The true enemy of man, so-called history, attracts and terrifies with its plural number. Don't believe it. Cunning and treacherous, history is not, as Marx told us, anti-nature, and if a goddess of blind faith. The little skeleton of Miss Jadwiga, the spot where her heart was pulsating, this only I set against necessity, law, theory. Well, I have been often asked what is my Weltanschauung, my philosophy. So I have a poem of 6 lines presenting my philosophy. If I had to tell what the world is for me, I would take a hamster or a hedgehog or a mole and place him in a theater seat one evening, and bringing my ear close to his humid snout, would listen to what he says about the spotlights, sounds of the music, and movements of the dance. I have a poem which the title of that poem denotes the quality of being a magpie. And in Polish there is one word, sroczność. But with my co-translator, Peter Del Scott, we hit at a solution, translated the title as magpiety. And this is a philosophical poem dealing with a very old philosophical quarrel of the Middle Ages, namely so-called quarrel of universals, whether the ideas precede the existence of things or things precede the existence of ideas, namely whether the idea of the dog exists first than the dog, or the dog first before the idea of the dog. And this problem hasn't been resolved till today. The same and not quite the same. I walked through the oak forests, amazed that my muse, Mnemosyne, has in no way diminished my amazement. A magpie was screeching, and I said, magpiety? What is magpiety? I shall never achieve a magpie heart, a hairy nostril over the beak, a flight that always renews just when coming down. And so I shall never comprehend magpiety. If, however, magpiety doesn't exist, my nature doesn't exist either. Who would have guessed that centuries later I would invent the question of universals? Well, maybe I should read a poem, a fragment of a long poem from the Rising of the Sun. This fragment is about my city where I went to school and university, and which is Vilnius, the capital, today capital of Lithuania, Lithuanian Soviet Republic. Whoever is born just once on earth could have been that man whom Isis visited in a dream and have gone through an initiation to say afterwards, I saw. I saw the radiant sun at midnight. I trod Proserpina's threshold. I passed through all the elements and returned. I came into the presence of the gods below and the gods above and adored them face to face. This is taken from Apuleius, the Golden Ass, mostly. Or a gladiator, a slave, under an inscription on a level stone, I was not, I was, I am not, I do not desire. Most distinguished voyager, from where do you hail? My city, in a valley among wooded hills, under a fortified castle, at the meeting of two rivers, was famous for its ornate temples, churches, Catholic and Orthodox, synagogues and mosques. Our country cultivated rye and flax. It rafted timber as well. Our army was composed of a lancer regiment, dragoons, and a regiment of Tartar horsemen. The postal stamps of our state represented phantasms sculpted long ago by two artists, friends or enemies, Pietro and Giovanni. Our schools taught dogmatics, apologetics, sentences from the Talmud at Titus Livius. Aristotle was highly regarded. though not as highly as sack races and jumping over fires on St. John's Eve. Most distinguished voyager, what was your eon like? Comic. Terror is forgotten. Only the ridiculous is remembered by posterity. Death from a wound, from a noose, from starvation is one death. But folly is uncounted and new every year. I took part. I tied neckties for no purpose and danced dances for no purpose. A customer, a buyer of sweaters and pomade, a mimicker, a shy guest, a fop impressed by his reflection in shop windows. I was overgrown by the bark of unconsciousness. I tried hard to imagine another earth and could not. I tried hard to imagine another heaven and could not. Large part of my poetry is based upon remembrances of my readings when I was a child. And one such poem is about, I read, when I was a small boy, I read a book about a boy who misbehaved, was very nasty, and a fairy, as a punishment, changed him into a fly for one afternoon. And here is, I wrote, many years later, I wrote a poem on that subject. Bobo, a nasty boy, was changed into a fly. In accordance with the right of the flies, he washed himself by a rock of sugar and ran vertically in caves of cheese. He flew through a window into the bright garden. There, indomitable ferry boats of leaves carried a drop taut with the excess of its rainbow. Mossy parks grew by ponds of light in the mountains of bark. An acrid dust was falling from flexible columns inside cinnabar flowers. And though it didn't last longer than from tea time till supper, later on, when he had pressed trousers and a trimmed mustache, he always thought, holding a glass of liquor, that he was cheating them. For a fly shouldn't discuss the nation and productivity. A woman facing him was a volcanic peak where there were ravines, craters, and in the hollows of lava, the movement of earth was tilting crooked trunks of pines. Well, I was falling in love many times, and not only with human beings, but also with various creatures. When I was a schoolboy, I had newts in a jar. And that was my passion. And many years later, I wrote this poem in a jar. Now, with all my knowledge, honorable newts, I approach the jar in which you live and see how you float up vertically to the surface, showing your bellies of vermilion color of flame that makes you akin to the alchemist salamander living in fire. Perhaps that's the reason why I caught you in a pond between pines when white April clouds race, and carried you to town, proud of my trophy. You vanished so long ago, I ponder the moment when you lived unaware of hours and years. I address you, I give you existence, even a name and a title in the princedom of grammar, to protect you by inflection from nothingness. myself no doubt held by powers who observe me and transfer me to some grammatical hyperform, while I wait with the hope that they seize me and carry me up, so that I last like an alchemy salamander in fire. There is a very short poem, philosophical, but very short. My parents, my husband, my brother, my sister. I am listening in a cafeteria at breakfast. The women's voices rustle, fulfill themselves in a ritual no doubt necessary. I glance sidelong at their moving lips, and I delight in being here on earth for one more moment with them here on earth to celebrate our tiny, tiny mineness. The poem is entitled Minus. I guess I should read a poem on angels. I have to find it. All was taken away from you, white dresses, wings, even existence. Yet I believe you, messengers. There, where the world is turned inside out, a heavy fabric embroidered with stars and beasts, you stroll, inspecting the trustworthy seams. Short is your stay here. Now and then, at a matinal hour, if the sky is clear, in a melody repeated by a bird, or in the smell of apples at the close of day, when the light makes the orchards magic. They say somebody has invented you, but to me, this doesn't sound convincing. For humans invented themselves as well. The voice, no doubt it is a valid proof, as it can belong only to radiant creatures, weightless and winged, after all, why not? Girded with lightning. I have heard that voice many a time when asleep, and what is strange, I understood more or less an order or an appeal in an unearthly tongue. Day draws near. Another one. Do what you can. Thank you. Proof. This is a short poem. Some critics interpreted that as referring to historical cruel events of our century, but I guess this is a very personal poem, and I guess that many in the audience here know by experience what I am talking about. Proof. And yet, you experience the flames of hell. You can even say what they are like, real, ending in sharp hooks, so that they tear up flesh piece by piece to the bone. You walked in the street, and it was going on. the lashing and bleeding. You remember, therefore you have no doubt, there is a hell for certain. And since this is a very pessimistic poem, maybe I would read a poem a little less pessimistic. Pure beauty, benediction. You are all I gathered from a life that was bitter and confused, in which I learned about evil, my own and not my own. Wonder kept seizing me, and I recall only wonder. Risings of the sun over endless green, a universe of grasses, and flowers opening to the first light, blue outline of the mountain, and a Hosanna shout. I asked how many times, is this the truth of the earth? How can laments and curses be turned into hymns? What makes you need to pretend when you know better? But the lips praised on their own the feet ran, the heart beat strongly, and the tongue proclaimed its adoration. I have to, maybe one more poem. So little. I said so little. Days were short. Short days, short nights, short years. I said so little, I couldn't keep up. My heart grew weary from joy, despair, ardor, hope. The jaws of Leviathan were closing upon me. Naked, I lay on the shores of desert islands. The white whale of the world hauled me down to its pit. And now I don't know what in all that was real. Thank you.
Ja jestem Joanna Kilian, gdybym mogła dostać...
My name is Carol. Thank you.
This is to Ken, K-E-N.
It was a very good night. We sold everything we had. The hardcover collected works was gone almost immediately.
How do you pronounce your full name?
My name? Czesław Miłosz.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Beautiful
Thank you.
person.
Thank you very much.
I really wanted to talk about poetry and politics a bit, and
it's a very difficult subject.
That's why I like to talk about it.
Very difficult.
I mean, do you think that you've accomplished anything in politics?
You ask now, I have to, that's an interview already?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I remember an expression, I guess, Reed said that English poet used the expression of the politics of the unpolitical.
I'm sorry, politics are...
Of the unpolitical.
Oh, politics of the unpolitical, yeah.
Yeah.
So do you feel that's...
I guess that politics is not something completely separated from other domains of human activity. And I believe that my contribution in this respect is more important than any political pronouncements, which were mostly unfortunate.
Do you feel that being a poet has affected your sense of politics?
You see, poetry has always been on the very limit of social and political commitments. If you take in the time, let us say, of the Reformation, when religion played the role of politics largely, of politics today, poets were either on the Catholic side or Protestant side, in any case in my part of Europe, in Poland. And they used to write theological treatises. Sometimes they are remembered only because of those theological treatises, sometimes vice versa. Those theological treatises are not considered important at all. So I guess that I have paid my dues to the 20th century through various imbroglios and various involvements with politics. Very reluctantly, though. I asked about politics and history. I always answer that a poet should try to avoid both as far as possible. However, there are situations when you are collared or cornered, and it's very difficult to escape.
Well, do you feel that, in any sense, that a poetry reading is a political act?
You know, people, I'm rather skeptical about the possibility of pursuing our professional interests separated from concerns of the public. I have taken part in various poetry readings, I should say as a young man, in huge poetry readings of political nature, and that for the first time when I got ashamed, because I noticed that when I read a political poem, the applause is enormous, because this goes together with the stream. And more difficult, more personal poems are much less appreciated. So that was for me a lesson to cure my exorbitant ambitions to please.
Do you feel that you can create, that a poet can create an ultimate reality, and is that good?
Well, you see, it seems to me that people can be divided into two basic temperaments, two basic categories. One temperament is for the external reality and tending towards external reality, and another temperament is denying that any reality independently of our mind exists. I do not speak here of philosophy. Of course, various philosophical schools are, let us say, embodiments of those two opposed temperaments. And I consider that I belong to that first temperament, namely tending towards external reality. I have a constant feeling of disparity between reality and the language, words. And I would describe my poetry as a hopeless search and pursuit of reality.
Well, by reality, do you mean a kind?
What
I mean,
reality is, we don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, it's almost like you're saying reality is God.
Well, I would be inclined to a medieval interpretation. Medieval interpretation, of course, what is the most intense, most dense, and most endowed with being is God.
Isn't that the same thing that one could say of poetry?
About intensity and well, that's very mysterious, because if you there were poets, of course, who pursued that goal to make their poetry a kind of an absolute substitute for the word, like Mallarmé. But the results are ambiguous, because the more a poet pursues absolute purity, the more the goal escapes.
Have you found in your life that your responsibilities as a poet have changed at all?
You notice a paradox of writing with the passage of years. For instance, in 1950, when I was really in a bad fix, I was still in the service of the Polish communist government, and I was horrified by what was going on, and I wrote a short poem entitled "You Who Harmed a Simple Man." I couldn't publish that poem at that time. 30 years later, that poem was placed on the monument in Gdańsk, erected for the workers killed in a battle with police. But that poem was written pure for myself only, not for any audience.
The question back to ultimate reality, you think can great poetry be written without faith, and without faith in an ultimate reality?
Well, today we have a situation when any belief in ultimate reality is lacking to most of poets. And for that reason, this is a very paradoxical time. But it seems to me that certain strong convictions, certain beliefs founding metaphysically the lasting value of a poem or a painting, that this belief has a very durable life and survives in many disguises. Because logically, if you do not believe in any foundation of reality, I should say metaphysical foundation of reality, then poetry disintegrates, art disintegrates completely. Disintegrates.
Oh, disintegrates. Oh.
Yes.
Well, that, in a sense, I mean, you're saying that that's what separates a conscious artist from a blackbird singing on a telephone line.
Yes, well, unfortunately, poetry is not singing on.
But I mean, there's that. It seems though that one becomes a poet before one is conscious of what poetry is, perhaps.
You see, a poet is part of a human society, and he shares many beliefs which are voiced, and also many very tacit beliefs which survive in a given society. He is a very sensitive instrument. He reflects that. For me personally, one of the subjects of my permanent reflection is a kind of erosion of religious imagination in the 20th century and consequences for the human mind, for the human imagination, which of course can be the best followed upon the example of arts and poetry.
Do you think that the idea of progress is antithetical to poetry?
Well, it seems to me that we have been living for a long time with the notion of movement of history, and the movement of history towards some sort of accomplishment. It goes back to Joachim of Fiore, a medieval monk who saw in history of mankind three epochs: the era of the Father, the era of the Son, and the future era of the Holy Spirit. And of course it has been taken over by romantics and combined with various modern utopias. But it has been a world constantly moving in a direction. It depends, of course, what sort of beliefs, what direction. But it's hard to imagine a world completely static. And poetry has been connected with a vision of a certain movement towards. Even if we take Ezra Pound and Ezra Pound's folly, insanity of considering that fascist movement was sort of implementation of order, moral order. There is that element also, certain accomplishment. Well, he was from Confucius, but that was all mixed up in his head. So poetry has been tempted by a dream of paradise, or at least of a good society. At the present moment, we live through quite a crisis of utopias. Utopias, even modest utopias, like for instance a welfare state in Sweden, proved to be terribly boring. And Marxist utopias proved largely to be failures first of all from economic point of view, but also the vital core, namely of a dream. The question arises, what for? And the question, of course, is being asked now in the Soviet Union, what for those millions and millions killed under Stalin? So we are now in maybe at a turning point. It is true that we always live in a turning point. History is living in a turning point. But now there is a big questioning. For me, I doubt whether modern man can live in a purely static, not dynamic society, not moving with any sense that we are moving in any direction. But I don't know. I have to leave it to my successors.
Do you think that there's a place, I promise you this will be my last poetry and politics question, but do you think there's a place where poetry can and must stand against politics? I mean, have there been poets in history that have had to stand for that, like that, the purity of the, I don't know, I mean, what you might call individual vision, or?
Well, I can give you an example from the last decade. Namely, when the martial law was proclaimed in Poland, practically all the writers in Poland were on the side of solidarity. And that was a terrible blow for them. As a result, literature became obsessed with writing against the martial law, against Jaruzelski, and especially poetry. For a couple of years you couldn't find any poetry except that poetry purely political. And I saw immediately a danger, because moving completely on the side of the best intentions, you obtain a moral purity, but you destroy poetry. And this is quite a dilemma confronting a poet in the 20th century, because we all are very open to seduction by morality. I would like to be moral beings, and to be, even as a late friend of mine, Witold Gombrowicz, said that ethics is a sex appeal of literature.
What is the role that you find, what is the role of love in the creation of poetry? Or does it even have a place?
Well, yesterday I read a poem, essay, on seeing a girl before me in a Parisian metro. And a very strong feeling of being, that she is, I am. Simone Weil, a writer whom I translated into Polish, says someplace that a strong feeling of that a given person is, really exists, is love. I don't know, I am not very competent in talking about that. For me, it's very difficult to distinguish between falling in love and with a woman and with the world. I guess my poetry has been erotic, but in a large sense, in the sense of Eros, as Plato says, an intermediary between the gods and the humans.
What about falling in love with an idea?
That's a very suspect kind of love. Well, very often people fall in love with ideas, with beliefs, and so on, which is maybe a translation of their self-love. They delude themselves very often.
What do you find is the strongest fuel for your own work?
I don't know. I hardly understand how all it happened. I always stress that I have been in the power of a daimonion who dictated.
Do you ever try to call up that daimon?
I don't know. I don't know who he is.
But it's a he?
Well, you see, we have a tendency to consider angels as males, though, of course, they can be as well females. But I wrote in a poem that I would like to believe that my daimonion is a good spirit and not evil spirit.
You said that you have said that that writing, and I think poetry is an attempt to describe an ultimate reality or an almost eternally losing battle. Do you think that when you look back on your work, I mean, do you feel that it's been like a series of tragic failures? I mean, you seem to say it's an impossibility to really accomplish.
I guess that striving is the most important, and as to the achievement, I don't know. And there is a constant striving, and I believe that I would like to believe that with my death I would discover ultimate reality. Because I feel that reality, ultimate reality is behind this tree and inside the tree, and I would like to reach that ultimate reality. Poetry was part of that reaching, going to the other side, so to say, of the curtain.